This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony. Felix Mendelssohn grew up in a household that was one of the intellectual centers of Germany. His father was a wealthy banker, his grandfather was one of the great Jewish philosophers of the 18th century, and family friends included Germany's national poet, Goethe. All of the Mendelssohn children received extensive music instruction, with Felix and his older sister Fanny showing amazing talent at very young ages. One of the advantages Felix had as a budding young composer was access to his own orchestra, an ensemble of family and friends that got together in the Mendelssohn living room every other week or so to play through, among other things, Felix's early compositions. Essentially, any musical inspiration young Felix might have could go from paper to performance almost immediately, although one of his greatest and most popular compositions took considerably longer than that to gestate. Mendelssohn had just turned 20 when he wrote to his friend Carl Klingemann in London that he was on his way to visit and that he was particularly interested in a tour of Scotland. It was the first of 10 trips Mendelssohn would make to the British Isles. Eventually, they would bring him enormous popularity as well as a friendship with Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. This first trip, though, was the only one that took him to Scotland, and it wasn't long before he determined to commemorate it with a symphony. Mendelssohn and Klingemann set out from London at the beginning of July and traveled from Edinburgh to the Scottish Highlands, west to Oban and the Atlantic coast, back south to Glasgow, and finally returned to London in September. While they were in Edinburgh, they stopped at Holyrood Palace, which is now the official Scottish residence of the monarch of the United Kingdom, but which had been the traditional home of the kings and queens of the Scots. Mendelssohn wrote later that in the evening twilight we went today to the palace where Queen Mary lived and loved. The chapel close to it is now roofless, grass and ivy grow there, and at that broken altar Mary was crowned Queen of Scotland. Everything round is broken and moldering and the bright sky shines in. I believe I have found today in that old chapel the beginning of my Scottish symphony." End quote. Back in his rooms, Mendelssohn wrote out 16 measures of music for piano with notes to indicate instrumentation. But that, for a while, was that. He went back to it a few times over the next few years, but it wasn't until late 1840 that those notes would become the andante opening of his Symphony No. 3. The symphony begins with a dark and brooding introduction. These are the notes Mendelssohn scribbled down in the shadow of Holyrood Palace in 1829. The passage gets its character from a rich mid-range orchestration of oboe, clarinets, bassoons, horns, and divided violas. When the violins enter, followed by the rest of the orchestra, the music grows more impassioned. But it's a quiet, simmering passion. The symphony is full of these kinds of quiet, intense passages, which are interrupted by quick, loud outbursts and sudden accents. The introduction fades away into near silence, where it quickly and quietly becomes an opening theme. But this section turns out to be transitional as well, as it builds in volume and texture and finally breaks out into a full gallop. Which carries it through to the end. But that forceful ending is more of a semicolon rather than a period. After what seems like closing chords, the woodwinds appear as if out of the mists, bringing back the somber opening melody of the introduction. But this short transitional section is actually a setup for the scherzo. The strings scurry around like the fairies in Mendelssohn's Music to a Midsummer Night's Dream. The winds contribute short outbursts like fanfares, and finally, a solo clarinet announces the bubbly main theme. Even though Mendelssohn didn't use any authentic Scottish folk tunes in this work, you'd be hard-pressed to hear this tune as anything other than Scottish. The opening phrases even wind up with the so-called Scotch snap rhythm, a quick note on an accented beat, followed by a longer note on an unaccented one. The scherzo is followed by an adagio. Mendelssohn mixes one of his signature sweet Victorian songs without words melodies with darker, more forbidding passages. Mendelssohn's biographer, Larry Todd, connected what he called the regal dotted rhythms in the darker passages to the tragic figure of Queen Mary, and concluded that the breathless, energetic finale, with its jagged dissonances and contrapuntal strife, generalizes the topic of conflict in Scottish history. End quote. That interpretation is not implausible, given Mendelssohn's tempo marking for the finale, allegro guerriero, or fast and warlike. And it's hard not to be moved by the part near the end of the finale, when the low woodwinds, horns, and violas, practically the same instruments that sang the symphony's sad opening, swing into the bright conclusion with what sounds for all the world like a hymn of victory. Different scholars have tried to give different meanings to this ending, contrasting the feminine prayer of the adagio with the masculine vitality of the finale, imitating a traditional men's chorus to celebrate Germany's present through Scotland's past. Even Robert Schumann got a little confused, referring in his review of the score to the master rediscovering old melodies sung in Italy. But the title page is clear. Mendelssohn's Symphony No. 3 is as Scottish as the haggis and bagpipes that he professed to hate after his journey there, which may be the reason that it took 12 years from that first scribbled phrase to the completed work. This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony.